K103 aims to bring Kahnawake an informative, community-oriented, and diverse talk show. To ensure a variety of voices and opinions, K103 reserves the right to screen calls. Our guests' opinions are not necessarily endorsed by or reflect those of K103 or its management. And now, the Partyline Talk Show on K103.7 FM, Kahnawake.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Partyline Talk Show. I'm your host, Luann Stacy, and today is MCK Friday. And our topic today will be the Iroquois Caucus and Anishinabek signing a declaration regarding the transportation of 100 truckloads of radioactive waste from Chalk River, Ontario to Savannah River, South Carolina. So in studio with me today are Chief Clinton Phillips and Dr. Gordon Edwards. Welcome, gentlemen. I'm really interested in hearing what's been going on since the last time, Dr. Edwards was on the show with us via telephone, and lots of movement on behalf of our two chiefs, our Grand Chief, Joe Norton and Clinton Phillips. So welcome, gentlemen, and let's get our topic going.
Thank you, Luann. With me, I'm happy to announce that Dr. Gordon Edwards is sitting with us. He's not a stranger to Kahnawake nor to K103, and we worked together several years ago as well. I had the good fortune of meeting Dr. Edwards at the same time when I first met Grand Chief Patrick Madabi. He is the Grand Chief of the Anishinabek Nation. He speaks on behalf of, I believe it's 140,000 Anishinabek people. So, I mean, those numbers are huge in terms of First Nations people. Anyways, recently, actually on March 22nd, we had our initial meeting in Toronto. Dr. Edwards was there, and we learned about this shipment that is being planned of radioactive waste. It's extremely alarming, and Dr. Edwards will get into the scientific aspect of it in a few minutes. Right now, I'll just give the people of Kahnawake an update on how we got here. We had a secondary meeting on April 5th, so things have been moving quite quickly in regards to this issue over a series of two separate meetings, and I'll say like a total of 10 hours total. We got to where we were yesterday. At the Iroquois Caucus, and the actual signing of a letter that was going to be sent to the Prime Minister of Canada, signed off by Grand Chief Madabi and Kahnawak's Grand Chief Joe Norton on behalf of the Iroquois Caucus. So we stand united as one, the Anishinabek of Ontario and the Iroquois Caucus communities that are in Quebec and Ontario as well. I think this is huge in terms of the message it sends to not only the Canadian government, but also to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, who is in charge of regulating this type of activity. We have another meeting coming up on the, I believe, 2nd and 3rd of May in Gatineau. The 3rd of May is actually the Chiefs of Ontario annual assembly, so we have been invited to attend that to present what we're going to be doing. We have also brought in the youth groups of AFN youth groups of Ontario and of Quebec as well. Also, the regional chiefs, Isidore Day attended the last meeting of April 5th. Unfortunately, Regional Chief Ghislain Picard was unable to attend on behalf of Quebec and Labrador due to his schedule, but hopefully he will be able to make it in Gatineau next week sometime. So it's a lot of work that has been accomplished in such a very short time frame. Like I said, likely 10 hours that we've participated. Of course, the administrative assistants who have been hammering out the declaration and doing all the work have been on this for a lot longer than just 10 hours. But here we are today. Our intent really is to bring focus to this issue. Our intent is to have National Chief Perry Bellegarde signed on behalf of AFN. Our intent is to make a unified declaration across Canada banning all types or any type of transportation of nuclear or radioactive waste on our territories. So that statement is really a mouthful. It's huge in terms of what a political statement. And it's something I believe that the Canadian government and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission cannot turn a blind eye to. They may be able to get around, communities and municipalities and maybe even provinces. But when you throw in the First Nations aspect of it, they can't get around us. And I think I take much comfort in saying when they tried to send nuclear spent generators from Bruce Power of Ontario through the Great Lakes and to his St. Lawrence Seaway system on its way to Sweden for decontamination. I really believe that the efforts of everybody involved, Dr. Edwards and his team and the people in his dedicated circles, and of course the involvement from the Anishinabek Nation and myself representing Kahnawake, I think, we are the reason why that this project didn't go any further and it was stopped in its tracks. I have no problem making that statement anytime or anywhere. So right now I'd like to bring in Dr. Edwards to give the people of Kahnawake a more in-depth look into what we're facing with this proposed shipment and exactly what it means to society in general. Dr. Edwards.
Thank you, Chief Phillips. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I have to say that Kahnawake has, and the First Nations have played a very important role in stopping ill-advised projects in the past. And it's really, I think that we in the environmental movement and in the white community who are really concerned about Mother Earth really look to First Nations for their leadership and their basically intuitive knowledge that water is so important. It's the lifeblood of the Earth, and that we can't contaminate our waters because this contamination is irreversible. Once it's contaminated, it's just, you've lost it. So now, what they want to transport from Chalk River on this particular shipments, these 100 shipments, which would take place over a period of about 4 years, and which would be, they would be huge trucks. In total, there's only 23,000 liters. That's quite a lot, of course. But right now, these 23,000 liters of highly radioactive liquid are stored in a tank, a single tank at Chalk River, which has to be continually stirred and monitored for heat because it generates heat. It's so radioactive that the heat is generated just by the radioactivity alone. And the thing about radioactivity is it cannot be shut off. Nobody knows how to shut it off. So this is going to continue to give off harmful emissions, which are called atomic radiation, for thousands and even millions of years to come. Inside the tank, there are dozens of radioactive materials, and people are often confused. They say, where did those things come from? I mean, surely they're not in nature, are they? And the answer is no, they're not. What is in nature is uranium. Uranium is a radioactive material, and it is dangerous. It produces radon gas, for example. It also produces radium and various radiological poisons. Like mercury, like arsenic, it's dangerous. We have to be careful about it. It's a natural thing. But when you put this uranium into a nuclear reactor, the uranium atoms get split or chopped up. And you end up with hundreds of brand new substances which are very unstable and which are unnatural. They're not existing in nature before we created them. And this is the stuff that's in this tank. Now, how did it become liquid? Well, they deliberately dissolve this irradiated fuel in nitric acid, boiling nitric acid. Why? Because they wanted to put it in a liquid form so that they could separate out something that they were after. Now, in the first years of the nuclear age, what they were after was plutonium for bombs. That's what they were separating. And that's what produced hundreds of millions of gallons of radioactive liquid left over from the weapons program. Now, in Canada, we decided to pursue peaceful uses of the atom. And so what we separate out are things called medical isotopes. And we use those medical isotopes for good purposes in hospitals. but it leaves behind a mess. It leaves behind this very highly radioactive liquid. So what do you do with this liquid? Well, two things that can be done. One is solidification. They're already solidifying 21 tanks of liquid waste at Chalk River right on site. They're not transporting it over the highways. They're not exposing it to the rivers and lakes. They're just solidifying it, putting it into a solid form, which is more manageable, of course. The other thing is that inside these tanks, there is a certain one small constituent, which is weapons-usable material. It's called weapons-grade uranium. Weapons-grade uranium is in the tank, just one of dozens of other materials. Well, it's for that reason that they say we want to ship it down to South Carolina, to get rid of the weapons-grade uranium so that it doesn't fall into, quote-unquote, the wrong hands. Gosh, with Trump in power in the United States, I don't know who the wrong hands are these days. But at any rate, this is insanity, however, because we know very well how to denature the material by blending down. It's called down blending, and Chief Joe Norton has advocated this, and it's a very sensible thing. Doesn't require any transportation.
Okay, could we take a little break and come back, because I have some questions and want to hear a little bit more about that. You're listening to the Partyline Talk Show. I'm your host, Lance Stacy, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Partyline Talk Show. I'm your host, Lance Stacy, and in studio with me on this MCK Friday are Chief Clinton Phillips and Dr. Gordon Edwards, and we're talking about the Iroquois Caucus and Anishinabek Nation Issue Declaration that has been signed, as well as a letter sent to the Prime Minister Trudeau regarding radioactive liquid shipments from Chalk River. As Dr. Edwards was speaking before the break, we're talking about the downblending, that process, and I didn't completely understand it, and if you could share a little bit with our listeners.
Okay. That's a bit complicated, a bit technical, but it turns out that when you dig uranium out of the ground, as I said, it's naturally occurring. You cannot make an atomic bomb from the uranium you dig out of the ground. It has to go through an elaborate process called enrichment, and it has to be highly, highly enriched. And what this means is that there's two kind of, you might say, twin brothers of uranium. There's uranium-235 and uranium-238, and they're twins. They behave chemically exactly the same. If you do anything with one, the other one goes along. They always tag along. They always hang out together. But one is a little heavier than the other one, and enrichment means that you gradually peel off the heavier one and get more and more concentration of the lighter one, which is uranium-235. That's the explosive. That's the one that they used for the Hiroshima bomb. In fact, that's exactly how they made the Hiroshima bomb. They threw away a lot of the uranium-238. They kept a very concentrated amount of uranium-235, and they put it into the warhead, and bam, there goes the city. Now, it's that very same material that Chalk River gets from the United States to make their medical isotopes. And in fact, I just found out today that there's another shipment of 3 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium, fresh weapons-grade uranium, coming from the United States to Chalk River just now. They're bringing in more. And that means there's going to produce more waste. So, this cycle is continuing. You might say, well, they're shipping the stuff down to South Carolina, so at least we're getting rid of it. Not really, because they keep on doing it. They keep on producing more. And that's one of the reasons I think that they don't want people to know about it. Because if people knew about it, they would bring the whole enterprise to a screeching halt. They'd say, this is crazy. We got to stop doing this. We got to stop producing the waste. The only way you can stop producing the waste is to stop the nuclear industry. You just got to stop it. It's a bad idea. It should never have been started in the first place. So that's one of the reasons why the government is secretive about it. But the dangers of this material are hard to fathom. And for those out there who might have a little science education, you might realize that atoms, everything is made up of atoms, we're told, and the atoms have electrons going around the outside, and then in the center they have this thing called the nucleus. And the reason we call it nuclear energy is because it comes right from that nucleus. Now, science knows that the power, the forces that hold the nucleus of the atom together are millions of times more powerful than any electrical or chemical reactions. And that's why the atomic bomb is so powerful. And that's why nuclear power is so powerful. But The difficulty is that you get all these chopped up atoms, like I said before. They're highly radioactive, and that radioactivity is a form of nuclear energy which cannot be shut off, and it's extremely dangerous. Now, just to give you an idea, as I mentioned with these shipments, I did a calculation using their own figures as what's in there, and using the own figures as to what is allowed to be in drinking water, the maximum level of contamination. Wouldn't you like to have water that's contaminated to the maximum possible level? Well, it turns out that all it requires is 2 ounces of this liquid to contaminate the entire water supply of the city of Washington, D.C. And this is simply using their own arithmetic and their own figures.
Wow.
So we're talking about an extremely, almost unimaginably toxic material. It's hard to wrap your minds around it. But years ago in the Ontario, they did a Royal Commission report on nuclear power. They published this in 1978, a long time ago now, of course. People are going to say, wow, were there dinosaurs? But no, 1978 was when this report was published. And they said, just to give you an idea of how dangerous this irradiated uranium is, if you took 1 reactor and 1 year's worth of radioactive waste from that reactor, and you wanted to dissolve it, God forbid, to the maximum level of radioactive contamination allowed by law for drinking water, how much water would you need to do that? And the answer is about 1 Lake Superior.
Oh, my Lord.
So then you take 20 reactors, each operating for 30 years, and you've got 600 Lake Superiors. So this simply tells you what an insane process it is, and it also tells you why the First Nations are really providing great leadership to people and saying they should not allow this stuff ever to be abandoned. Because if you abandon it, it just means you're walking away from your responsibilities to future generations. The First Nations know very well how knowledge can be passed on and must be passed on for thousands of years, continuously from generation to generation. And that's what we have to do. We have to inform people now about the dangers of this material, and going forward from generation to generation, we have to never forget that this stuff is sitting there and it has to be looked after. The good thing is we know how to contain it, we know how to package it, and we have to know how to repackage it as time goes on. We cannot abandon it. And this is the first point that the First Nations people have put down in their declaration, which is really providing leadership on the issue.
And I guess that was one of my questions, was basically, what was this document going to do? What was it going to help, one, I guess, create awareness? But beyond that, what was the next steps? And what, because this battle, I thought, was going to start, or, whatever. I didn't see thinking 7 generations and thinking beyond, because most people aren't aware of this.
Right.
And that was one of the questions I received yesterday during the Iroquois Caucus when I presented on where we are today and how we got here. One of the questions from one of our, I believe it was Tyendinaga, who would be very close to a likely route this caravan would take. They're not going to be releasing what routing it's going to take for the fear of terrorism. And that notion alone should be frightening to a lot of people. But I think one of the, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Edwards, one of the anticipated likely routes would be over the Thousand Island Bridge. So Tyendinaga should be very alarmed at that, because it is in their backyard. And one of the questions I received yesterday from Tyendinaga was, why are we not hearing about this? Why is it being so secretive? This should be front page news and headlines on every 6 p.m. news. And my reply was, because the government and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission does not want society to find out about this for fear of trying to shut them down, to stop this insanity. It can't continue, and if it's up to the First Nations people to promote and to educate, non-Native people about, thinking 7 generations and beyond that, as their guiding light on how they think and consider what they're doing, then we need to educate a lot of people. Mm-hmm.
Well, for me, this is like the 2nd or 3rd time hearing about it, and, well informed on a lot of issues. And it was like, the more I'm hearing, the more scarier it is. It's, especially drinking water that sustains our life, and, not allowing people information, and government worrying about terrorists, and it just escalates and makes the issue even bigger.
Well, exactly. We learned, and I believe it was Dr. Edwards who, when he was in Toronto with all of us on April 5th, that this caravan following a shipment would have their own hazmat people, their own security people, and their security people will have clearance to shoot to kill. Yeah. Now, what does that tell you?
Yeah.
Yeah. The problem is even worse than just secrecy for the purpose of not disturbing our pretty little heads. The fact of the matter is that the nuclear industry operates like a state within a state. They run their own affairs, and they basically tell the government what to do rather than vice versa. The government has abdicated responsibility to the nuclear industry, and I think it's time that we, the citizens of this country and the First Nations of this country, long before there was a government, a national government, has got to tell them, wake up. You have to be responsible for future generations. You can't allow the nuclear industry to just do what they want for their convenience, because that's what's going on now. Mm-hmm. Now, fortunately, with leadership from the grassroots, from the people, and from the First Nations, we have managed to thwart decisions made by the nuclear industry. They decided and got all the approvals to send radioactive steam generators through the St. Lawrence River and over to Sweden. They got all the approvals and permissions they needed, but it never happened. Why? Because the people would not allow it, and the First Nations would not allow it. We also had in Quebec, we had all the permissions to rebuild the only nuclear reactor we had at Bécancour. It's called Jean T2, a nuclear reactor, and they got all the permissions to go ahead and rebuild it so it could operate for another 30 years. Never happened. It got shut down. Why? Because the people and the First Nations just made it clear that they were not going to put up with this. Mm-hmm. So the leadership on this issue, like on all global issues, I believe when it comes to things like women's rights, when it comes to things like human rights, First Nations rights, when it comes to things like anti-war, anti-nuclear bombs and so on, the leadership has to come from the grassroots, because we're the ones who really have a sense of Mother Earth. We're the closest to Mother Earth. People who get high up in government, they become more preoccupied with their own little piece of land, their own little turf, which they think the Earth is flat, because outside the borders of the country they govern, there's nothing, right? So this has got to change. And I think that this holistic idea that the Earth is round, we're all part of it, we're all interconnected, and therefore we cannot continue to poison our nests. We're the only species on Earth that poisons our own nest.
Interestingly enough, the last time I worked with Dr. Edwards, and it was about the Bruce Power fight, we met with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission as part of the Assembly of Chiefs of Ontario. So they were there. The commission was there, and I got up and I asked them a very simple question. Since you started since the commission has been in operation, how many requests for permits have you ever denied? And the answer was 0.
Wow.
So I mean, that's a mouthful. Every request that comes in, they're rubber stamping it yes. So again, society needs to be alarmed at that.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, there was a report just recently. Fortunately, we have a good Minister of Environment right now, I believe, Catherine McKenna. She seems to have some real guts and some imagination and some determination and some principles, which is rare in a politician these days. But she has, for example, twice put off the plans of Ontario Power Generation to build a nuclear waste dump right beside Lake Huron. She's stalling this, and she's preventing them from going ahead with it, which is very good, I think, for us. I think that we should appeal. What I was going to say is that she recently received a report on environmental assessment. And this report said that the environmental assessment process should be taken completely out of the hands of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, because they have been captured by the industry they regulate. In other words, they're simply part of the industry. They're basically, and as Chief Phillips just said, to this day, we also got this confirmation just weeks ago, that to this day they have never refused a license. Never, not once. So it's basically a rubber stamp organization. When they were having hearings up in Mistissini in Cree territory, I was on the telephone and intervening in a hearing there, and I asked Binder, the head of, Michael Binder, the head of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, I said, does your commission have the power to stop this project? And he said, well, we haven't made that decision yet. We'll let you know when we make the decision. I said, I'm not asking you what your decision is. I'm asking you if you have the power to stop this. And his answer was, I don't know.
That's really scary. This is coming at a great time, guys. We'll take a little break and we'll be right back. And welcome back to the Partyline Talk Show. I'm your host, Lance Stacy, and in studio with me are Chief Clinton Phillips and Dr. Gordon Edwards, and we're talking about the joint declaration that was sent out between the Iroquois Caucus and the Anishinabek Nation. I guess, Clinton, I wanted to talk a little bit about the letter that was sent to the Prime Minister and where exactly, like, what's expected? Is it going to be a stalling of having this go through? Is it going to help stop it? What are, like, next steps? Like, to me, this is just the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess our first defense is to get public buy-in on this issue, and to put it out there to Canadians and First Nations people across the country about exactly what's happening, because the governments and the regulatory bodies are not, they're not on front page news, as we said earlier. They're not letting people or society know about this. So the letter that was sent to the Prime Minister as of yesterday. I'll just read one of the paragraphs, and if anybody out there wants to read all the 3 documents, you can go to Kahnawake.com, and the 3 documents are posted on there. Again, Kahnawake.com. So in one of the paragraphs of the Prime Minister, it says that these unprecedented radioactive liquid shipments were agreed to by then President Obama and then Prime Minister Harper in 2012. As part of an effort to eliminate foreign stocks of weapons-grade uranium from U.S. origin. We are accordingly writing to you as the current Prime Minister of Canada to reconsider this option, as the government of Canada has failed to consult our nations. So I guess that would be our number one outcome, and it is, again, because it's something that Prime Minister Harper brought into effect. Prime Minister Trudeau could easily reverse that as well. It was an Obama, now Trump thing. So again, there's wiggle room there for us, and hopefully once the Prime Minister of Canada, gets our letters and again. In deliberating with his ministers, mainly McKenna of Environment, hopefully there'll be a different outcome to this ludicrous proposal.
Because I think it was stated that it was supposed to start shipping this spring.
Yes.
Right?
They have been preparing for a number of years. This goes way back to 2012, as the chief just said from the letter. So these preparations have been underway. But we discovered just last year that in only 3 months, Indonesia, which also had the same material from the United States, weapons-grade uranium, the same stuff we were talking about earlier, they had converted that into liquid for the same reason, to produce medical isotopes. They had exactly the same stuff in Indonesia, and they downblended it in 3 months. It was cheaper, faster, and safer, and the problem is gone. And they don't have to transport it anywhere. So they have set an example of how easy it is, relatively speaking, to do this. And really, we have looked into this rather deeply, and we've discovered that more than anything else, it's a make-work project for the nuclear industry. They're doing this for their convenience, and $60 million of taxpayers' money is going to get paid to Savannah River in South Carolina just to receive this stuff. And the reason they want it is because they have hundreds of jobs at stake for processing liquid waste, which, since they're not making plutonium for bombs right now, they've got this to do instead. So the reasons for doing this are really contemptible. They're not really reasons in the public interest at all. They're reasons which are related to the convenience and the profit of the nuclear industry. Now, another thing that Prime Minister Harper did is he took a publicly owned corporation, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited at Chalk River, and he turned it over to private companies, 5 multinational profit-making private companies who are in it for the profit. And they are now wanting to build a huge waste mound, unbelievable, 70 hockey rinks in base and 7 stories high, all made of radioactive waste. And they want to, and this would be projecting about 95 meters above ground. It would not be underground or anything. It would just be right above ground. And it would be, they want to abandon this waste there. So that would be sitting there for thousands and thousands of years to come, right beside the Ottawa River, which, may I remind you, flows right down to Montreal here. So as this stuff leaks over the centuries, it's just really totally wrong. And we have got to get the current government to realize that our previous Prime Minister has done a lot of things that have made the future of this planet much more in peril, and the future of our waterways and even our drinking water here in Montreal are going to be imperiled by this if we don't do something about it now.
Exactly, and I believe that's where we come in, because if the Prime Minister since the election has been, you know, his rhetoric has been loud and clear and confirmed by his ministries, and the ministers have told us directly that, again, no relationship means more to the Prime Minister than that of the First Nation, then surely, when he hears our outrage, he will have to react.
Mm-hmm. And I believe that because we now have a recommendation which has been greeted by the Catherine McKenna, the Environment Minister, with praise, saying that the environmental assessment process should be taken completely out of the hands of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So we're hoping that we can get a meeting with the Minister, with Chief Phillips and myself, and some other people, to go and see the Minister and say, listen, don't just put the kibosh on this. Stop the process. Do not allow the licensing and the hearings. And we're talking here about the nuclear waste dump, because that's the process that's underway. But once we get her attention on that item, which is easier for her to exercise authority on, we can then ask her to put a bug in the Prime Minister's ear about stopping those liquid shipments too. Mm-hmm. So it's a double whammied approach. And it's really we've got to appeal to the people to make their voice loud so that the nuclear industry's voice can be, for once, drowned out.
I'll take this time now to read a letter, parts of a letter that was signed off by Grand Chief Patrick Madabi of the Anishinabek Nation, and it's addressed to Minister Catherine McKenna in Ottawa, Minister of the Environment. Part of the paragraph states, our First Nations community occupy a significant percentage of the land and waters within the Great Lake basins, where we exercise our constitutionally protected rights to occupy the land, fish, hunt, and gather traditional foods and medicines. It goes on to say that I would like to remind you that the Great Lake Basin provide fresh drinking water to approximately 30 million Americans and 40 million Canadians, and whatever affects the Great Lakes Basin will affect us all. So that's part of the letter that Grand Chief Madabi signed off to McKenna, and we, MCK, will be sending a similar letter to Minister McKenna as well. Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's the start of the following up, trying to get the letters read and heard and hopefully halt it for now and then continue.
Yes, and this is actually a new era we're entering into, because up until the present time, up until recently, let's say 10 or so years ago, the nuclear industry gave the impression that they were in charge of things and that they were going to protect people and they were not going to let this stuff get out. They were going to keep it very under close scrutiny. But now what's happened is the nuclear industry is winding down. There hasn't been a single new nuclear reactor built in Canada since 1978. There hasn't been, and in the America, in the United States, they're shutting down reactors faster than they're building them, also in Europe, in Western Europe. So the nuclear industry is winding down, and we're now entering into the age of nuclear waste. For the first time in human history, we now have a company, an industry, the nuclear industry, who is proposing to abandon permanently dangerous toxic materials right beside major waterways. And this is only in recent years that this has been happening. So what we have to do is alert the government to the fact that this is totally unprecedented, because they're making decisions for eternity. They're not just making decisions for the next 10 or 20 years. They're making decisions for eternity. And they should not be allowed to do this by a corrupt process, or to do it at all, really, because our belief, and my organization is the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, we believe that that it's improper to abandon these things, because abandonment presupposes that amnesia is going to set in. People are not even going to know what this stuff is, or how to cope with it if it does start leaking, how to prevent it, how to protect themselves. So we think that, contrary to the idea of abandonment, which is for the convenience of the industry, we think that we should have rolling stewardship going forward, where generation after generation is taught about these things and the dangers and the necessity of keeping a very close eye on them and repackaging and reinforcing the containment as time goes on.
Maybe, Dr. Edwards, you can let our listeners know too as well when the last accident has occurred, specifically at a Thousand Island Bridge in March.
Oh, yeah, that's right. There was a horrible accident, which many people may have seen on the news. I actually have some clips that I saved because they're so dramatic. A whole pileup, 60 vehicles right beside the Thousand Island Bridge, involving, I believe, a dozen or so of these huge transport trucks, one of which was carrying a very toxic chemical, which spilled out onto the road, and which they had to decontaminate first responders and also decontaminate some of the people who were involved in the accident. Because, and in fact, they had to shut down the 401 highway for a considerable period of time in order to try and erase the traces of this dangerous chemical. Now, if that had been the liquid waste that we were talking about earlier from Chalk River, they would have to dig up the road and bury it as radioactive waste, because, in fact, that's what they had to do on the Chalk River site. In 1952, they had an accident. They had a meltdown in 1952 at a small reactor, and the core of the reactor was destroyed, and they had to put it on a flatbed truck and drive it just a short distance. It's still sitting there. And but in driving it, they had to have a relay team of drivers. One driver would go into the cab and drive it for a minute, and then he would run out of the cab because his radiation exposure was too high. And another one would run in and drive it for another minute. And as it was driving along, it dripped some of the material onto the road. They had to dig up the road and bury the road as radioactive waste. That's what they would have had to done to Highway 401. So moving this stuff over public roads and bridges is crazy.
That is scary, really scary. And I guess what's really interesting is that it goes back so far, where people were thinking of actions that were in the present, not necessarily what would happen in the future, especially the waste management kinds of things, and not really looking at the impacts beyond that, you know? And I think what's even more scary is that today, there's so much information that we know, but this is not a topic that your average community person would be looking at.
No, and that's one of the really sad things, that there's no, you know, the trouble is that people don't realize that the nuclear industry in Canada was created by the government of Canada. They're the ones who created it. And it was all part of the World War II atomic bomb project. In fact, the decision to build Chalk River was made in 1944 in Washington, D.C., and it was part of a project to produce plutonium for atomic bombs. They even have a plaque at Chalk River saying, this is where the first nuclear reaction in Canada occurred, and the purpose was to produce plutonium for bombs. It's right there. They even had a secret laboratory on the slopes of Mount Royal, right now where the University of Montreal is, and they had scientists from France, from Britain, and from a few other European countries working in top secrecy on methods to produce plutonium. The first reactors that were built in Canada were to produce plutonium for bombs. We sold plutonium to the American military for bombs right up until 1972 from Chalk River, that was produced in Chalk River. And as a matter of fact, we gave a copy of our Chalk River reactor to India, and guess what they did with it? They produced plutonium and built a bomb and exploded it in 1974. The first Indian atomic bomb was thanks to a Canadian nuclear reactor that we gave them, that was really one of the best reactors available for producing plutonium.
Wow.
You know, I guess maybe, you know, just to let our community know, for those who are unaware, Chalk River, where we're talking about, is about an hour and a half north of Ottawa. So it's not a million miles away. It's a little more than a 3-hour drive for us over here.
That's it.
So, you know, you look at Chalk River and all this stuff going into, you know, if there was some type of catastrophe or whatever, dumping into the Ottawa River, which, as Dr. Edwards stated, flows into the St. Lawrence. So are we have more reason to be concerned? Absolutely. Does it mean we are going to be involved in this issue? 100%. You know, I'm going to be on this like, you know, fly on maple syrup.
All right, that's a good analogy. I wasn't sure where you were going to go with that, Clinton. But I think it is something that has to be followed up and has to be staying front and center. If not, the results or things that could happen is scary, because I don't even think as a society right now we have the people who have all that knowledge to be able to what could be done, what would happen.
Yeah,
you know, it's scary.
The good news is that you don't need to know all, you don't have to have a lot of knowledge to understand that it's stupid and crazy. And there have been, this is the good news too, is that we've stopped in here in Quebec, we've stopped things that seem to be unstoppable. We stopped the Gentil 2 reactor, it's gone, you know, it's shut down. We stopped the shipment of those steam generators. We also stopped the United States of America from building a waste dump right on the borders of Quebec down near Memphremagog. We stopped that because the U.S. Department of Energy wanted to build a waste dump there, and our government, thanks to our citizens, sent a message down to the White House from our ambassador saying that Canada would not look kindly on the building of a waste dump right on our borders, right on the borders of Quebec. Premier Robert Bourassa declared publicly that Quebec would never allow nuclear waste to be stored on its borders or on its territory. Well, guess what? Chalk River is right on the border of Quebec. It's just across the river from Quebec. So here we are. We're down the road, and we're doing something that we said we'd never do.
Within 2 weeks after the meeting in the first week of May, actually that is in a week and a half, I guess, we'll know more. We have events planned to bring focus on this. We actually are planning a powwow at Chalk River.
Oh.
So it'll be huge. It'll be huge. So there's things that we're going to be bringing forth to our communities and keeping pressure and the focus on this issue. So it's going to be in everyone's face probably from now on.
Yeah, this is not just the transportation of the liquid waste. It's really the beginning of the age of nuclear waste, and it's going to be an ongoing mobilization.
Yeah. That sounds really good and nice to know that there are people watching out for us. You know, it's a little bit scary hearing some of this.
And people have a right to be scared. People have a right to be scared. I mean, if you ask the owners of British Petroleum, BP, you know, did they believe that we're going to have a leakage to the degree they had a leakage several years back in the Gulf of Mexico, which caused havoc on wildlife and the environment? You know, accidents happen, and this proposed shipment is an accident waiting to happen, and it's something that cannot happen.
Okay. Well, I thank you, gentlemen, for coming in and for sharing this information with us. And Clinton, thank you for staying on top of this for our community, and that we know that we're being taken care of a little bit. And if you could keep us posted, and feel free to come back in and share with the community, I think it's a worthwhile information.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and anybody can look at our website. It's www.ccnr, that's Charles Norman Roger.org. And there's stuff right there on the Chalk River mega dump that's being proposed, and so on.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And we're done for the day. Have a good weekend, Kahnawake. And Onagiwahi, we'll see you next week.